My pleasure to welcome our hosts from Business Perspective, Marissa Longsworth and Carlo Habet. Good morning to both of you. Welcome.
Good morning. Good morning, Ernesto.
Morning, Ernesto. Morning, Marissa.
Good morning, Carlo. And welcome to all of our watching audience, viewing audience, and listening audience across Belize and outside the borders of Belize. Thanks for tuning in to this Tuesday's Business Perspective, brought to you by the Belize Chamber of Commerce and Industry in affiliation with Love FM, Love TV. So just to get started, we know that today, Carlo, our guests are going to be two attorneys. I am not going to play attorney role today. I'll play interviewer role today, but we will have two attorneys as our guests today, namely Mr. Andrew Marshalleck, Senior Counsel, and Mrs. Ashanti Martin, who is also the Secretary on the Executive Council of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And why we have asked them to come in is because we do have a draft, what's called Civil Asset Recovery and Unexplained Wealth Bill that has been presented to stakeholders in general by the Government of Belize. And so we're starting to look into that draft and to make our comments on what we think about the provisions that are contained in that draft and how effective those provisions could be. There's a lot of talk about legislation, Carlo, putting things in writing, putting things in law. Do you think that this, from your perspective, maybe myself as an attorney in the everyday world, I use the law actively, but do you think that, from a perspective of other Belizeans who are not in the legal field, that these legislations mean much to them, or is it just a magic bullet in your view, or is there more that has to happen?
Well, as a layman, because I'm definitely not as well versed as yourself or our guests coming in, I think that we need it, and I would say we need it precisely because I guess we can point to the past and say that whatever we have hasn't worked. But I'm very curious actually to chat with our guests coming up too, because I recall, I think at one point, Mr. Marshalleck had given an interview where he had basically alluded to the fact that, well, our laws already accommodate for some of these things, which then brings up, I think, an even more kind of troubling thought, which is that even though these things are already illegal, we still have no recourse as a populace, or maybe we don't know. And maybe that's the more important point, that we don't know how to kind of handle these things as a people. And so, in a sense, we're at the mercy of whoever who knows what's going on. And then people tell us, oh, well, there's no way to get this done. And we just kind of like throw our hands up. But I think as a typical layman Belizean with no real serious legal knowledge, you're definitely you're feeling out of your depth in a sense. And I guess we look to people like you guys who are really, again, well versed in the law, and there's so many different laws and they tie in different ways, and I think that we can appreciate that, and so we sort of look to the legal minds to guide us. But I think it's necessary for at least, like I mentioned, that reason that it's not worked before, so we do need to change something, no? And the whistleblowers thing, I think, is key, because I think one of the things in Belize, and not just from a perspective of, let's say, these larger infractions, but even on a more basic level, we're afraid to call the police, because we don't trust anybody. I think that in itself, it's a serious problem in our culture, in that we're afraid to do the right thing because we're afraid that no one is going to back us up if we do the right thing, right? But we know that if we do the right thing, people who are doing the wrong thing, they might come for us, right? So we need protection to do the right thing. So, and I think unfortunately in Belize, on so many different levels, doing the right thing is not incentivized,
And so what do you think about that, Carlo, in terms of the cultural perspective of good governance and what's necessary for that aspect of things?
It's a good question. I think, unfortunately, over the time, and I have a problem maybe putting a finger on exactly when, but I think at some point corruption and let's just say corruption became sort of endemic to our population, and I think everybody sort of got in on it in a sense. So at this point in time, I feel like it's more the norm, unfortunately. And so the idea of a cultural change, as you mentioned, it's paramount in the sense that we as people have to also change how we live our lives. And that might sound a little bit much, but I think it takes a sort of mindset shift for us to go from, okay, we're just going to let everything slide. Because I think that's one thing about Belize, right? And I think one thing people actually like about Belize, whether they're local or foreign, we tend to be a place that people kind of attribute a sort of unbridled freedom that you can't find in other countries. And I would attest to that. I do feel like in Belize, we are afforded an extreme amount of liberty and freedom in the sense that we're left alone. People don't mess with us. We rarely get calls from any department about anything, So we rarely come in this situation of having to go to court, of having to have some sort of moral or ethical or legal dilemma, because no one is really, let's say, keeping track, and no one is holding anybody accountable. But I think on a certain level, the people on the ground, I think we feel somehow implicit. I mean, and this is my psychological take on it, right? Like, we're sort of implicit in the sense of we are not holding the people above us accountable. But I think it's also, but I think it might come from this. I mean, and again, this is me being like an armchair philosopher here, but I feel like it might come from our own, let's say, desire to not be messed with as well. We don't want people to
right. Is it a matter of throwing stones at a glass house kind of thing, or having having it ricochet right back at us because we are equally involved in the situations as well? Or even if we point to one over there, many of us in the population know that there's something or some process we've done in the past that we have implicated ourselves as well. And it just, in some cases, comes very easy, You just have someone, a friend that you know, and they say, hey, why are you in line for so long? Let me help you out. You shouldn't have to wait in this line for so long. But we don't realize that that in itself is a form of corruption. That is a favor from a friend,
Yeah.
Those sorts of things do make a difference.
No, for sure. And actually raise a really good point, because something so simple as cutting the line, right? Like, we don't see that as wrong. I mean, how many times have you been in a line to go anywhere? Maybe you're just going to the movies or getting your popcorn, or maybe you're going to a concert, and we see people cut in front of us. And I think from what I have seen, and even I myself have been a little bit reticent in these situations, because you say, well, you don't want to cause an uproar, but most times people are allowed to do these things, and people are still like in the line kind of like seething about it, but we're like, oh, gee, this one, that. But you didn't do anything about it. And so I think really the cultural change that has to happen, and that's something too that, I mean, you raise a good point that even I myself have to kind of remind myself, is that we have to do the right thing. And sometimes it's not as hard as we might think it is.
Right.
And a lot of times when people are faced with the right thing, the right option, they know, right? And so you might always feel like there's a drama waiting to happen, but most times I've seen too that when people call people out, let's say in that same line situation, and say, hey, you don't belong there, you know what they do? They begrudgingly go to the back.
Go to the back,
But they do it. Of course there's some people that are, whatever, and
But there are some, but you're right. They know that on being called out, that there was a process of right or wrong already happening in their head, and it's like they just needed confirmation from someone else to say, no, that's wrong. We shouldn't do that, and some moral click happens in the head where they say, okay, or the ethical click that says, okay, I will do the right thing. We have received, as the Belize Chamber of Commerce and Industry, we have received a draft bill called the Civil Asset Recovery and Unexplained Wealth Bill 2021. This bill, of course, is one of the grouping, one in the grouping of bills that are considered to be good governance legislation by virtue of what the legislation is expected to cover and to produce for the country in terms of results relating to property that can be recovered, that has been quote unquote stolen or otherwise illicitly removed from the government or from others. And so we are joined by Mr. Andrew Marshalleck, Senior Counsel, welcome, and Mrs. Ashanti Martin, who is an attorney at law, as well as our secretary for the Belize Chamber of Commerce and Industries Executive Council. Welcome to both of you. Thanks for being with us this morning.
Morning. Thank you for having us.
Morning. You are always welcome here.
I've seen you actually, I think you gave an interview once, I think it was with Jules, I think it was after one of the hearings, and I think you kind of echoed similar sentiments that we already have laws that could speak to getting this property back, and that there are already laws that were contravened clearly to get these assets into people's hands. What is it, I mean, if this could be an easily answerable question, what is the main thing that stops us from enforcing these laws, in essence?
Well, the creation of law in and of itself does nothing. It's ink on paper. It's a creation and empowerment of institutions necessary to enforce and give them life. And that is where we always fail. And here we go again, creating another agency. We already have the Integrity Commission. Now we'll have the Civil Asset Recovery and Management Agency to go along with it, go along with the FIU, go along with police, the Commissioner of Police, the Comptroller of Customs, the Director of Tax Services. Those are the people empowered or given authority to use these tools. The tools are good, they're great, they're new and powerful and nice to have. But it remains to be seen whether or not this agency, this new one, will be empowered and resourced to do something.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Right. No,
I was just going to agree with you, Andrew. I did note that in this particular instance, though, unlike under the Prevention of Corruption in Public Life Act and how the Integrity Commission is dealt with, that there is, at least in theory, in the law, there is provision for a budget for this particular agency, and the agency is given the right to employ consultants and other experts that they may need. I think one of the concerns that we have had, and I'm speaking on behalf of the chamber here because this is something that we've said publicly, while the Prevention of Corruption in Public Life Act is very good and it sets out in very brief, terms, different violations and offenses for public officers, the legislation itself doesn't have teeth. The Integrity Commission itself has never, I don't think that there is any instance where it has actually investigated the declarations that are submitted by the public officials, which are very limited under that act. And so I am hopeful, and I agree with you, Andrew, we have to wait and see. I am hopeful that the agency is given a bit more teeth than the Integrity Commission is. So that will obviously come down to the persons who are appointed as trustees and their expertise and the budget. Importantly, I think, is the budget that they're given to be able to do these investigations. Otherwise, I agree with you, it's just another agency and it's another tool in the toolbox that's just been, it's out there, but it's just going to be parked.
This is being a new agency, more bureaucracy is being formed in the context of the government being able to meet its primary balance, in the context of cutting back public service, or the wages of public servants. And you go establishing an agency with 2 civil asset trustees who are attorneys of 10 years experience, who gets to be appointed by the Judicial and Legal Services Commission, which gives the impression and the experience required is you're talking people at the level of Supreme Court judges, and then you're also talking about a third person with audit and financial experience, more than 10 years, a very senior auditor, and then all the support that goes along with it. And the obvious question is, how do you sustain, feed, and give such an agency resources to properly function? But apart from that, and that will be a challenge every government will face, apart from that, these tools, the property restriction order, the civil asset forfeiture order, the unexplained wealth orders, they all originate from public servants. Director of Tax Services, Commissioner of Police, Controller of Customs. All of those persons are engaged and served at the, I think at least two of them, Customs and Police for sure, under Section 107 of the Constitution. They serve at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. Director of Tax Services, I'm not so sure, but I suspect is the same case. When we look at case studies for dealing with corruption and implementation, for success in the implementation of these kinds of measures, many people often point to the experience Hong Kong had, because they've moved up the index over the years. Of course, it took 30, 40 years to clean up corruption. It's not an overnight proposition. But it started in the 70s with the establishment of an independent commission against corruption. Because if you're going to complain about corruption by people in public office, you need to go to somebody else to do it. And here you are trapped in the same situation of going to the public service to complain about public servants. I'm not so sure that that is a good model.
I would agree. I wanted to ask specifically, because earlier, before you guys came on, we were speaking about how illicit enrichment often has another component, which is money laundering. And I guess that's, which also then has a tax evasion component. And I guess that's how sometimes you catch these people. And then you mentioned the FIU a while ago. And I was thinking, what is it to stop these these institutions from essentially talking to each other? Because I think too, someone like the FIU would want to get in on something like that, because a lot of times too, you're talking about like money laundering and maybe cross-border type stuff, and I know that's what they're interested in. Do they have? And I've always wondered. I've kind of posed this question to people, especially because of how our politics run. A lot of times you'd say, well, the people who are really doing these larger things, you need to look within your own, essentially, right? With the public service at some level. Does the fact that they're outside, are they outside enough? Do they have any teeth at all to deal with, let's say, past transgressions on public officers in money laundering type cases?
I lost you for a minute there, Carlo. Just a question again, please.
Okay, no problem. No, I was saying, is the FIU outside enough? Do they have any real teeth that they can go after these type of people, but through like a more money laundering, agenda / slant, no?
Yes, their powers are extensive.
Mm-hmm.
Belize's history. Well, let's look at it. In terms of FIU, there have been a number of high-profile cases, but nothing that has resulted in any significant convictions for anything. We've had a case during the last term of government where the Commissioner of Police was taken to court and an order of mandamus sought to compel him to investigate and to take action in relation to wrongdoing by a ministerial government. We've had, over the last few years, we've had a senior personnel from the tax department being arrested and indicted in the US for using these assessments to extort money from business people. We've had many allegations against customs over the years. It seems to me that the problem lies not in accessing available tools, but in overcoming certain obstacles to initiating these processes themselves. I don't want to say that it's only a lack of will, because I don't think it's just that. I think it has to do with us living in a small society, us being at some level or the other friends with each other, and being unwilling to hold your friends to the requisite standards. And there seems to be an unwillingness to do that.
I did find it interesting that in looking at this legislation, I didn't see that the FIU is one of the bodies that can, in the course of its investigation, bring claims for protection orders, restrictive orders, or forfeiture orders. I would have thought, and I guess this ties in with the question that Carlo asked, immediately when you're thinking about money laundering, when you're thinking about white-collar crime, the FIU is one of the bodies that you think about that in the course of its investigations would discover that there is tainted property. But it's not one of the institutions that can institute an application under this particular legislation. It can under the Money Laundering and Terrorism Prevention Act, but under that act, the forfeiture order only comes into play where there is a conviction. So that is the difference between the two legislations. I would have wanted to see the FIU also be able to apply for orders under this act. And of all the agencies that have been mentioned, I think the FIU arguably would be the most independent, or at least some level of independence. It's built into its legislation, even if, you know, we may have our concerns. I think one of the things that was absent from this legislation, and I think that still doesn't answer one of the most important components of asset recovery, or, you know, looking at illicit gains, is where does the training come in to investigate these crimes? I think one of the deficits that we've always had is the inability of our police. And I won't blame them. I think it is a lack of training. When it comes to white-collar crime, we just haven't been able to investigate those. And so I think for this to work, certainly there has to be some investment on the part of the government in training the police, in training all of these bodies in investigating white-collar crimes, because they're the ones that are going to be initiating any process under the Civil Asset Recovery and Unexplained Wealth Act, in whatever form it is passed.